Today, we'll be looking at Thanks for the Feedback by Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen. By examining the core thesis of the book, examining the three types of feedback in the workplace, and looking, most importantly, at how we can apply these concepts as leaders in higher education. What is the fastest way to improve organizational feedback? Is it to empower givers to give the best possible feedback, or is it to actually upskill and coach receivers on how to receive feedback themselves? Organizations spend billions of dollars teaching people how to give feedback, but the truth is that the receiver is ultimately responsible for what is learned, and that's the big idea in this book. The authors argue that creating pull or actively seeking and sorting feedback is more powerful than pushing harder as givers. Managers, supervisors, and leaders are often taught to give productive feedback, but constituents are rarely coached on how to receive feedback. The truth is that feedback isn't one thing, it serves three very different purposes, and we need to understand those purposes to better receive feedback. Feedback comes in three flavors: appreciation, coaching, and evaluation. Confusing those or blurring the lines between them creates frustration for both the giver and the receiver. It generally just creates weird miscommunications to where we aren't on the same page with one another. For example, if I want coaching but I get evaluation, I feel judged instead of helped. But I like to think of feedback as three buckets instead of these bubbles that are just completely separate and disconnected. Because each one of these pieces of feedback is vital to learning. In fact, receivers must take each type of feedback in its respective bucket or risk confusion. And trouble starts when one bucket overflows or gets spilled into another bucket. Remember when we used the example earlier of wanting one type of feedback but getting another? This is an example of where feedback can go wrong. When things start to intermix, they just get confused and the feedback gets lost. The authors identify three triggers that make feedback hard to hear. Truth triggers question accuracy. Is this feedback right? Does it apply to me? Relationship triggers question the giver. I can hear this feedback, but I can't hear it from you. And then finally, identity triggers shake our sense of self. I feel threatened by this feedback. Even at the point of questioning ourselves in the moment, we gaslight ourselves on if the feedback is even worthy of us hearing. But just as our feedback triggers, there are some tools that we can use to guide how we respond. First, understand before judging. And this is viewed through the truth lens. We need to understand what the feedback is and how it's being intended before we judge the giver. Second, separate feedback from the relationship. Don't switch track. In other words, we tend to go back and forth between the relationship we have with the giver and the feedback itself. And if we don't keep those two things separate, the feedback gets even more confusing. Finally, keep identity distortions in check by reminding yourself that feedback is data, not a definition. In other words, contain the story of the feedback and keep it in its lane. In a book that's seemingly written through a corporate lens, how can we apply these theories from the book to higher education? In my role, annual evaluation can feel punishing. Things that happened 6 months or a year ago that were still part of the same evaluation period all of a sudden come up in your evaluation. In reality, those issues could have been dealt with and improved upon throughout the evaluation time. Evaluating in this sense can erode psychological safety and trust between a leader and a constituent, while often blurring the lines of professionalism and personal relationships as well. But there are some simple solutions from the authors that we can take away. As in most institutions and most corporate environments, evaluation feedback comes once per year. We often just get it all in a lump sum, whether we're prepared for it or not. As leaders, it's our job to make feedback a normal part of our routine. As a receiver, perhaps it means putting a regular meeting on your supervisor's calendar or as part of an agenda item in a broader group. We also need to make feedback purposeful. So when we're in these feedback meetings, we need to make sure that we structure them and make sure that we direct the conversation toward the correct type of feedback: appreciation, coaching, or evaluation. And then build psychological safety. Remember, feedback is data. It's not a definition of who we are. It's important for us to recognize that feedback often isn't a personal attack. It's a tool to be used to make us better employees and better leaders. Finally, we need to signpost evaluation or feedback meetings. Feedback can be messy, as we've already seen, so it's important to guide the conversation. The authors use this concept of signposting where you, as a recipient, recognize that there are multiple topics involved. So you might say something like, let's talk about topic A and then let's talk about topic B. Or you may need to steer the conversation by saying, I hear that you're saying A, but we really need to be talking about B today. Doing this also helps feedback recipients set personal and meeting oriented boundaries. As you've seen, feedback is complex, often complicated, and always tied to people and unfortunately their emotions. But as we've learned, when taken as data and in the right context, feedback can be valuable, even for receivers who can stimulate and drive complex conversations. So I ask you, what's one experiment you'll try with feedback moving forward? For me, it's normalizing feedback into regular meetings because I recognize that these small steps create big cultural shifts and big performance boosts. So, that said, thanks for watching and thanks for the feedback.